I have a book idea for those of you out there who are desperately searching for a winning book idea. Maybe you're an author or a historian or just somebody looking for, a niche that you can exploit. I've got your book idea right here. And I don't want to say that I'm promising you you're going to make a lot of money with this idea. I am guaranteeing you will get attention. You know how the book deal works. Sometimes you get your attention with the first book and you make your money off the second book. Whatever. You don't have to cut me in for any of it. The reason I'm giving this idea to you is because it's worthless to me. I wouldn't touch this with a 10-foot pole. Makes me a little sick just thinking about it, but there are people out there who have stronger stomachs than I have. If you're one of them, here's your idea. Go write a book about this little explored angle of the famous World War II story. Go write a book about the long-term positive effects, things that made our modern world better today, of Nazi Germany. The upside of the Third Reich, I guess you could say. The things that we have today that make our life better that never would have happened if there had never been an Adolf Hitler, right? Go write that book. You will do more radio interviews about it. You'll get more attention on the book circuit. You'll probably even have all these protesters outside getting news coverage, which then, of course, just advertises your book idea even more. Have fun with that. And realize that if you have any trouble with it, if you get a little backlash or something for obvious reasons, that it's just because you're ahead of your time. Somebody's going to write this book. Might not be for a couple of centuries, in which case you're going to pay a terrible price, of course, for being early, for being a visionary. Nonetheless, the way history works and the way history writing works pretty much guarantees that any gaping vacuum in a popular story will eventually be examined. You leave a piece of a story untouched for a while, and when every other angle of that story has been examined to death, somebody's going to look at that vacuum and go, nobody's written a book yet on this side of Nazi Germany. And the reason you know that this is true is because you can see it happening in every other area of history where there's any interest at all. Revisionist history is a classic term, often used by people who are sneering at the idea. They wish that whatever view of history, was in vogue 200 years ago stays the view of history, and nobody ever changes that because then you're messing with the way things really were. The way things really were, though, of course, are in part determined by people's viewpoints at the time. We've always talked about on this program, haven't we, about getting a little distance from events allows you to become a dispassionate observer, get a more three-dimensional, view of things with the emotion leached out of the story. Now, most of the time, that's an advantage. Most of the time, it allows you a dispassionate observer status. But it comes at a cost. You lose something in the story once the emotions are gone. The main thing you lose is any feeling of loss in terms of human life. Communist dictator Joseph Stalin so famously said, "One death is a tragedy. 1,000,000 deaths is a statistic." And what he's emphasizing with that statement is that once you stop knowing these people you're talking about, and once you stop having a connection to these dead people, they're not going to matter anymore. It just becomes part of the long train of casualty lists that makes up human history. Nobody weeps for people who died 500 years ago. You go write that upside of the Third Reich book today, and people who still feel the pain of the loss of loved ones in a still relatively recent situation in the Holocaust and the many wars, obviously, that were fought regionally as part of this giant war, the Second World War, those people are going to pick at your book signings because they still are attached to the dead. If you don't write that book and it doesn't get written for 500 years, you're not going to have very many picketers outside. By then, those deaths are a statistic. And the story loses something because of it. The story loses the sense of evil and outrage that today wouldn't let you say good things about Adolf Hitler today, because who cares about the good things? Look at the bad things he did. The reason maybe I feel so strongly about this is I specifically ran into this situation back in college. A professor who's still at the University of Colorado, where I was a history major, was the teacher who taught the Chinese history courses, and I'd taken a bunch of his courses, and I was going to write a paper, and I thought he was the closest advisor to really having a good feel for this subject because he was Chinese. The paper was on Mongol military tactics, the tactics of the famous Mongol army, probably the greatest army of all time, in the 1200s. I spent a whole semester focusing on this paper, really long research paper type thing, all on strategies and tactics and stratagems and the theories behind what they did and blah, blah. I mean, just an intense paper on military tactics. And I turned it into this professor. He called me in next week. We sat down. He handed me the paper with my grade on it. It was a whole grade lower than I thought it should be. And I'm leafing through the paper while he's talking to me, not really hearing what he's saying. And over, he's writing in red ink in various places on the paper. What about the civilians? What about the deaths? What about the executions? It was over and over. It was all about the nasty things that the Mongols did. Specifically, in this story, the nasty things that they did to the Chinese people, his ancestors. And when I asked him why this was something that lowered my grade, because the paper didn't have anything to do with that, it was a paper on tactics and strategies, he said, how can you divorce the military that made all of that Holocaust possible from the Holocaust itself? He said, if you were writing a paper on the German Wehrmacht in the Second World War, would you leave out the Holocaust? And I said, yes, because it has nothing to do with the Holocaust. One is about this angle of history. The other is about the other angle. He says the Wehrmacht made the Holocaust possible. I remember leaving that meeting thinking that he was too emotionally wrapped up in this whole thing because he was ethnically Chinese and he was feeling this pain and suffering left over from the terrible Mongol conquest. And he wasn't seeing this straight. The emotion, somehow, of deaths in the 1200s was still affecting my ethnically Chinese history professor. That came back to me when I was reading some of the stuff for the story I want to talk about today. We're in a period of revisionist history with the subject, as we are with most subjects. Everything's in flux, right? But we're in a particular swing of the pendulum, I'm sure it will correct itself over time on this subject, where historians and others are writing about this subject and minimizing the deaths completely. Considering that this is one of the greatest incidents of human-caused mortality in the planet's history, minimizing the deaths here would be like minimizing the deaths caused, as a direct result of the existence of the Third Reich and the Nazis. It'd be like saying, yes, lots of people died, and we all know that, but make sure you focus here on the economics in Central Europe, blah, 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 blah. My Chinese history professor would say, don't lose track of the Holocaust in this. Now, let me tell you why it puts me in a weird position. It puts me in a weird position because I'm a fan of these people. I want to talk about the Mongols, these same people I wrote this paper on in college. I've been interested and fascinated with them forever. I have an affinity for them. The problem is the stuff I'm reading today has swung so much to the other side of the classic image of the Mongol rapist and pillager, from 100, 200 years ago, that I almost don't recognize the people anymore. I'm reading books that brush off 30 to 50 million deaths. Brush them off. A sentence here or there saying, yes, the Mongols did great damage in certain places, but that's dwarfed by their impact on globalization and trade and commerce. And you would call it the classic trade-off of empire. There was a great line that was uttered at the time of the Roman Empire about the Roman Empire, where the person uttering the line said, the Romans create a wasteland and call it peace. Just because you killed all the people and burned down all the houses doesn't mean the trade routes won't run fantastically in that wasteland. These are some of the classic empire trade-offs, and many of the greatest historical figures, greatest in air quotes there, are people who get a lot of credit for their achievements based on stuff that happened that they never intended, byproducts of their historical deeds. And if you took away those byproducts that was credit given to them by later historians, their whole demeanor looks different. Take Alexander the Great as a perfect example here. Alexander the Great is one of the most admired historical figures of all time. There are many historians today who run against the grain trying to point out to you that that is totally undeserved. When you read about the things that some guy like Alexander the Great gets credit for, it's all stuff that he never intended to have happen. I mean, you read your history books, and Alexander takes this fantastic killer army, kills untold numbers of people, conquers all these territories for himself, basically, his future glory, his Macedonian nobles, loot, spoil, you name it. Achilles and glory. And this has the byproduct effect of spreading Greek culture, for example. Alexander's conquests are noted, for example, for spreading Hellenism to the east, which then triggers the Hellenistic age, which is one of the great, ages of mankind. And so, therefore, whatever Alexander did that was terrible as part of his conquests is somewhat balanced out by this positive stuff, by bringing, Sophocles' drama and lifelike statues and artwork to eastern Iran, I guess. When historians do that, they are shooting an arrow and painting a bullseye around it afterwards. They're acting as though that was somehow Alexander's intention and that he deserves credit for that achievement. Instead, it's a byproduct of what he did, and he never intended it at all. And if you take away all those byproducts from his achievement record, he ends up looking like a very different character. Take Julius Caesar for a second. Here's a guy that conquers modern-day France, known then as Gaul, destroys the Celtic domination of the region, kills millions of people. It's been called a genocide before. Does it for his own personal gain, for money, for political power in Rome, for the rich class in Rome. And Julius Caesar is often credited for bringing modern-day France into the Latin and Mediterranean cultural sphere, hooking them up to the, grid of that era, so to speak, bringing culture and literacy and all these things to that area. If you went to a modern Frenchman today and said, was it worth it that the Romans killed all those Gallic peoples but brought you into the cultural sphere of, Roman life? And I imagine many Frenchmen today would go, well, yes, it's certainly worth it to us in the long term to have that happen. Of course, the person you're interviewing on the street didn't know any of the people on the Celtic side who had to die to make that possible. How many Celtic deaths is the introduction to Mediterranean culture worth? How many Iranian deaths is the spread of Hellenism worth? Well, if you don't know them, and it's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years ago, the number of deaths really don't matter anymore. We're still benefiting from the fact that Hellenism spread, and we didn't know any of those people who had to die. If you take away or exclude these byproducts of these historical conquerors' careers, things like the spread of Hellenism for Alexander, these conquerors end up looking a lot more like people who came on the scene and inflicted a horrific amount of killing and suffering on others for no good reason. Unless, of course, you consider conquest a good reason all by itself. If the conqueror in question happened to be an ancestor of yours, you might indeed, consider it a good thing. It's interesting how countries will associate their own greatness with the largest spread of their territory, geographically speaking, or the greatest domination over other peoples. You look at a map, and the high watermark of nations is when they encompass the most territories and have the most people under their control and, win the most victories in battle, whatever it is. We still think of national greatness the way they thought of it in earlier times. We just aren't as enamored with the overt use of the powers it sometimes takes to achieve that. Historians are just as susceptible, by the way, to looking at the bright side of conquest. They will almost argue for the need sometimes for these people to appear on the scene. These people, in the minds of some historians over the ages, have been agents of change. There's a term used in economics that I think applies here: creative destruction. The best way I could think of to describe creative destruction's concept is when you think of an old forest, one that's rotting and bug-infested and choking the light from the ground, and nothing can grow, and it's just stagnant and dying and not going anywhere. It's a waste. And then a fire comes and burns it all down. The ashes regenerate the soil, The clearing allows the sun to reach the ground. The space that's been created allows new seedlings to pop up, and you create the conditions for new growth and regeneration. The way historians have written history casts certain individuals in that role of historical arsonist for a good cause. The world is stagnant. All these cultures are literally in rotting houses that just can't seem to fall from their own weight, and then Alexander the Great comes in with gasoline, lights the whole region on fire, and, creates the conditions for the next world to sprout up. Julius Caesar does the same thing. All of a sudden, these people who never had any intention of starting a new world, so it would be better for all of us, get credit for that. And as generations pass and we forget the names of all the people that died to make that possible, all of a sudden, these people who don't deserve maybe a good label attached to them when you look at their motivations for what they did, begin looking increasingly benign and great over the ages. The figure that I want to start this story with today falls into the same category. It's a category of people that you have to call great men, in the classic sense, great in quotation marks, the great men of history. There was a historian, also a member of Britain's Parliament about 100 years ago, named Lord Acton. And Lord Acton had a great line about these people. He said, "Great men are almost always bad men." And what he means by that's pretty obvious. Let me ask a question to you this way. Would you be willing under certain conditions to order the killing of an innocent woman or child or old person? If you said that you would not be willing to do that, you are already off the potential great person list, at least in terms of world leaders. Even the most humanistic world leaders, when it comes to their own personal outlook. I think of a guy like Jimmy Carter, a president that might have been so humanistic that he had a hard time doing his job sometimes, a guy who builds Habitat for Humanity houses. Here's a guy who probably was responsible for less deaths as an American president than any other president I can think of in modern times, and yet there's still, certainly, quite a few people who died because Jimmy Carter made a decision one way or the other. I couldn't handle that. Hence, I'm off the potential great person list. Some of these great people, the Alexanders, the Julius Caesars, and these people, had to be willing to kill millions. How should history treat that? As Lord Acton said, great men are almost always bad men. But what happens if they're the ones who are historically necessary to go around lighting the dead wood of these decaying societies on fire so we could create the conditions for a new age? Enter the seed of this story. The seed of this story is one of the more exceptional human beings that's ever been born, especially in terms of achievement, certainly in terms of gifts as well. He's not the beneficiary of some wonderful luck in terms of his birth. He's not like Alexander the Great, doesn't get the best army in the world handed to him instantly. Have the plate all set.